Dovid. Right, starting.
Starting.
About 18 years old. Alright. Just turn the Facebook video on. We're gonna Good evening, everyone. Good? I want to thank everyone for coming out again for our Beit Midrash program. Our Linden Beit Midrash program in conjunction with Yeshiva University. We are, before I mention our host and our speaker, not our host, our speaker for the evening, it is sponsored by the Gertrude Weil Institute of Jewish Learning. We thank everyone for their support of our programs, and we hope for your continued support in the future. We're honored to have Rabbi Dovid Hirsch here. Rabbi Dovid Hirsch is a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, as well as a Rav of Shul Seik Beis Yosef. On a personal note, I'm probably the only graduate from Rebel who is still registered as a junior at Yeshiva University. Without getting into all the details, I was at YU as an undergraduate student for 1 year. I think the collections agency is still coming after my parents for the junior year that I never showed up for when I ran off to Baltimore. But the 1 year that I was at YU, my second semester, my first semester I struggled mightily in all subjects, and most troubling, I was struggling in my Gemara shir as well. And for my second semester, all of my friends were in one particular shir, and all my chaverim said, "Why don't you join us in Rav Hirsch's shir? That's the shir to be at." I said, "Well, I'm struggling my first semester. I might as well, my second semester, give it a shot." And I had the honor and privilege of being in Rav Hirsch's shir for the second semester, which I tremendously enjoyed, and that was not the reason why I left. It was tremendous to learn from Rav Hirsch. I think what stood out for me most, in addition to his Bekias and his knowledge in Kol Torah Kula, what stood out most was Rav Hirsch's Avas Torah. Such a passion for Torah that just permeates the whole room, the whole shiurim every single morning, and that was something special to behold, especially someone who's just coming back from a couple of years in Eretz Yisrael. You're still trying to keep that fire burning, so when you get it that first year back, it means a lot. So that was very impactful for me. So I took that passion with me throughout the rest of my years until who I am today. So I thank you, Rav Hirsch, for that. So the Rav Hirsch's topic this evening is priorities in Mitzvos Bein l'chavero. Once again, we're really excited to hear from you, and we're honored that you have joined us in our Linden community. Rav Hirsch.
Thank you. Good evening. Bereshus Rabbi Hess, Shlita. You have a great privilege to have such a Rav who's well-learned, but more importantly, matches his learning with his Midos Tovos, Menschlichkeit. So may Hashem bless you, and may you continue to shepherd this holy congregation for good and for good things in the future. You know, we as B'nai Torah always want to engage in fulfilling the mitzvah of Chesed. You know, the Gemara writes in Maseches Yevomis that how do you recognize whether there's a Jew or Jewess walking in the street? So the Gemara says there are three elements. One is that you can, if the person is kind. Second, if the person is humble. And third, if the person is merciful. If that person, man or woman, has those traits, then the Gemara says you can bet your bottom dollar they're Jewish. So the first element is kindness. So we always want to engage in kindness and being kind people, because that's what part of being a Yid is. And a lot of times the halacha gives us an opportunity to fulfill Chesed, the mitzvah of kindness, but there are times we need to make a priority decision which one comes first. And it's not enough to just say I'm engaging in kindness and Chesed and that's enough. But we know that the Torah and the halacha mandates everything that we do in life, and we have to also look into our guide, which is the Torah Kedosha that Hashem gave us, the Holy Torah. We believe that Hashem gave us the written law and the oral law. And the difference between the Jewish people, what made the Jewish people the chosen nation, is that we were given the oral law as well. The oral law consists of the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is the Talmud. The written law, non-Jews can study just as well. But when it comes to the oral law, the Gemara writes that non-Jews are prohibited to study the Mishnah and the Gemara. And that was where Hashem made his pact with us to establish the Jewish people as the Am HaNivchar, with studying the oral law. So the halacha has a say when you have to make a priority decision. You have a triage case. Which chesed should I do first? So I want to begin with an interesting question, and that is, we have a situation where I have to decide, should I pay a shiva call first, which is called nichum avelim, comforting the mourner, or should I visit the sick, which is called bikur cholim? Which one comes first? One would have said, what's the difference? They're both chesed. Says the halacha, no, we must delve into what exactly the Torah says about this question. So let's open up the packet. We're not going to read everything inside, but I do want to read the first statement inside. We know one of the great Torah figures throughout Jewish history was named the Rambam, Maimonides. The Rambam lived 1135 to 1204. The Rambam was a big tzaddik, a righteous Gadol, Torah giant. I don't need to tell you that. And he was not a show-off. And he wrote a sefer called the Yad HaChazaka. It's called the Yad HaChazaka, the strong hand, because there are 14 books. Yad is 14 in Gematria. And he writes in the introduction that he codifies all the dinim in Shas, and therefore all you need after his book is finished is a Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, and his Sefer. Because his Sefer is a codification of the whole oral law. So the Rambam writes, every so often in his Sefer, he says, I have a novel concept. Yeroya li means, I have a chiddush. A chiddush means that I have a novel chiddush, a novel concept I want to convey. Because usually the Rambam is just quoting the dinim in Shas. But he'll quote Yeroya li, and the Ravid, who was another great Torah giant, the Rishon, will argue on the Rambam, will say, what do you mean it's a chiddush? It's a Mishnah, it's a Gemara, it's a Brisa. So the Rambam himself posited this question. Let's read the first line. Rabbi Benilchus Ovel, Perik Yedal L'Lochavov. Yeroya li, it seems to me, Shenechomes Avelin Koidem Lebikr Choilim, Shenichem Avelin Kim L'Schesedim Achayim B'Mamesim. Writes the Rambam The Shiva call takes precedence over visiting the sick, because the Shiva call has a double kindness. It is Chesed with the Nifter, with the Neshama, the holy soul of the deceased, man or woman, and you're also doing Chesed, a kindness with the people that are sitting Shiva. Whereas when you visit the sick, it is solely a Chesed with someone that is living. Hopefully the man or woman will get better. Higher mathematics, I can even figure it out. 2 Cheseds versus 1, the 2 win. Writes the Rambam, paying the Shiva call beats out visiting the sick. This is the theory of the Rambam. It is quoted by the Ramah in Yordeya in Siman Shin Lamed Vav in the name of the Kolbo. I don't know why it doesn't say the Rambam, but it's the favors the Rambam and the Kolbo, another Torah giant Rishon, has this psak halacha. If you look on the side of the page in the Shulchan Aruch, the Shach quotes in the name of the Bach the following distinction, which is what we should follow. When does paying the Shiva call beat out Bikr Cholim? Only when you have enough time to do one of the two. If you only have enough time to do one of the two, then you pay the Shiva call. However, writes the Shach in the name of the Bach, if you have time to do both, then you should visit the sick first, because the Chayla might need you. I'm not talking about Pikuach Nefesh. If it's to save the person's life, you got to go there right away. But maybe the Chayla needs a newspaper, needs some food. What are the 3 elements that are needed to fulfill the mitzvah of Bikr Cholim? Number 1, to bring some food or newspaper or Sfarim to the Chayla. Number 2, if you're born under the same constellation, you remove a 60th of their sickness by simply visiting him or her. And number 3, you must daven. Before you leave the hospital room, you must say to Hashem in front of the ill person, I hope to Hashem that Hashem will heal you speedily. You must make that prayer before you leave to fulfill the mitzvah of Bikr Cholim in its complete way. Therefore, says the Shach in the name of the Bach, if I have enough time to do both, then Bikr Cholim first, and then Nichum Avelim. If you only have enough time to do one, then you do Nichum Avelim. And this is what we should follow, Halacha L'Maisa. Then it comes up. You might be so busy, going on a business trip, whatever, to be busy with everyone's dealings that they have. You only have enough time to do one of the two, then pay the Shiva call. If you have time to do both, first visit the sick, and then do Nichum Avelim. Okay. But the Rambam doesn't distinguish. And the Rambam seems to say that visiting the sick loses out to paying the Shiva call. Now we have a rule that no one can ever argue on the Gemara. The Ramah writes in Chesed Mishpat and Siman Chafei, Ravina v'Ravashi Sofo Ra. The Gemara was closed in 400 CE, and that closed a chapter in history. And the Vilna Gaon writes on the Ramah, that's it. No one can ever disagree with the Gemara. After 400 CE, there might be Rishonim that are elucidate the Gemara, but you can never argue on the Gemara. It wasn't just a historical statement. It's a halachic statement. Ravina and Ravashi were 2 great giants, Amoraim, Sofo Ra. Never can argue on the Gemara. And in number 2, we won't read it inside, the Gemara in the Seches Sukkah records the schedule of the tzaddikim of Yerushalayim on Sukkos. They loved the lulav. They always held on to the lulav the whole day. And their schedule, they would daven, they'd hold the lulav, and then after davening, they'd have lunch, and then they would go and visit the sick and pay a Shiva call, which we're going to get back to, God willing. How can you pay a Shiva call on Yom Tiv? We'll get back to it. But there is a notion. and they would go ahead and do mitzvahs holding the lulav the whole day, because reason makdim the mitzvahs, they show alacrity towards mitzvahs. And you know what it says in the Tosefta in Maseches Sukkah? They first would be mavaker chayla, and then they paid a shiva call. So the great Gaon, the Or Sameach, who was from Dvinsk, I believe he was nifter in the 1920s, maybe 1908, 1926. Or Sameach asks, the Rambam is against the Gemara. Here the tzaddikim in Yerushalayim, first they visited the sick and then did Nichum Avelim, and the Rambam said that Nichum Avelim comes first. You cannot argue on the Gemara. So the Samech asks on the Rambam, you're against the Gemara. Now I thought to answer that question that you can make the distinction we just said before. Maybe the Rambam only meant when you have only enough time to do one of the two, then paying the Shiva call wins. Beating out, visiting the sick. But the case in the Gemara was where they had time to do both. So maybe that's the distinction. The Or Sameach did not like my answer, because when the Rambam writes the word kodem, what does kodem mean? Kodem means before, it wins. The stom of the Rambam means both scenarios. Number one, in a situation where you only have enough time to do one, and also in the situation where you have time to do both, which one comes first? The Rambam doesn't distinguish between the two cases. So it's hard to give that answer, and the Or Sameach does not give that answer, even though Ladina were saying that we follow the Shach in the name of the Bach. So the Or Sameach did not like this answer. Now, you could say, and in paragraph number 3, there are different texts in Shas. Those are called girsas. We have a big sefer in YU, the Bismet is called Dikduke Sofer. A big sefer that has all the different texts of the Gemaras. And in the Minkin edition, Munich edition, Ksav Yad Minkin, it's the Munich edition, and the Rosh has the Girsa, he flips the Girsa. That the Tzaddikim Shalayim first did Nicham Avelim, first they paid the Shiva call, and then they visited the sick. So maybe the Rambam had the Girsa of the Rosh, and the whole Kasha doesn't start. Can answer the question very easily. The problem is you cannot give that answer, because in number 4, the Rambam in another place in Ilchos Lulav records the schedule of Tzaddikim Yushalayim. And what does it say? It says they did first Bikr Chaylim and then Nicham Avelim, which is what our Shah says. So the Rambam did not have a different Girsa. He had our Girsa. So now the Rambam is against the Gemara, and he's also against himself. It's a twofold question. He's contradicting himself from Hilchos Avol to Hilchos Lulav. Number 1, the Rambam is against the Gemara, because the Rambam said Nichum Avelim, paying the Shiva call wins. And the Gemara says that the Tzaddikim first visited the sick. And the Rambam records that himself. So not only is the Rambam against the Gemara, Rambam contradicts himself. So what are we going to do? How are we going to answer this question? What we're engaging now in is learning Torah, is learning the oral law, a question, an answer. This is a description of Hashem. Hashem and the Torah are one. They are inextricably linked. How do we relate to Hashem in this world? We daven to Him and we learn. This is what we learn in Yeshiva. A kasha, an answer. You're speaking to Hashem. Hashem manifests Himself through the Torah. Do you know the Anshe Shlomo writes that if someone takes a gun to my head and says, Dovid Hirsch, I'm going to kill you unless you murder someone, unless you commit adultery, or unless you commit idolatry. What's the halacha? I have to let myself be killed. Yehareg v'ayavor. What happens if he says, I want you to eat a ham sandwich? As long as it's not in front of 10 Jews, the ham sandwich I eat to save my life. Yavor, transgress it and don't be killed. But the 3 cardinal sins, I have to let myself be killed. What happens if a man comes over to me and says, Dovid Hirsch, I want you, next Shabbos when you give your drasha, I want you to say ham is kosher, or I'm going to kill you. What's the halacha? Says the Anshe Shlomo, I have to let myself be killed. Why? It's not one of the 3 cardinal sins. You know what the Anshe Shlomo says? Yes, it is. It's avodah zarah. It's idolatry. Because by me getting up in shul and saying ham is kosher, I'm describing a foreign deity. The Torah and Hashem are one. The Ramban writes every letter of the Torah, Shemo Shel Hashem. If I get up there and I say ham is kosher, I'm describing a foreign deity. That's tantamount to avodah zarah, idolatry. It's a subcategory. I have to let myself be killed. Reb Moshe argues and says I don't have to. But I want to just bring out, Rabbi Chaim Volozhner writes, Hashem and the Torah are one. That's what we're engaging in now. The process of Talmud Torah. The process of a question and answer. And therefore we have to embark upon how are we going to save this Rambam. The Rambam is against the Gemara. How could it be? So, there was a great Gaon, genius in Torah, who was a chief rabbi of Yerushalayim named Rav Zulti, Rav Betzalel Zulti Zatzal. And I want to share with you the mahalach that he offered to answer this kasha on the Rambam. So let us begin. If you glance at number 5, we'll read that one line inside. It's a short one. Amar of Yehuda, it's a Gemara in Shabbos, Kufnan Beis Amud Aleph. What is the halach if someone dies, God forbid, and has no relatives? No 7 relatives. Father, mother, son or daughter, brother, sister, or spouse. That is the 7 relatives in halacha. Someone dies, Rahman al-Itzlan, and has none of those 7 relatives. What do? 10 men from the community go to that person's home, and they sit there for at least the minyanim, and the rest of the nation comforts them. We had this, there was a great Gaon, I don't know if you remember, Rav Josh, about, there was a great Gaon, Rav Nevsky Zatzal. He was blind. Remember, he was a Talmud Chacham, a Talmud of the Rav Zatzal. He would sit in the library. So he passed away. He had no relatives. He was a great Gaon, he was a Talmud of the Rav, Talmud of Rav Hutner Zatzal. And he, Lamais, lived on the other side of the heights. When he was nifter, we had 10 guys go, Shachris and Minchen Ma'ariv, and everyone would come and congregate. What is the purpose of that paying the Shiva call? There are no relatives. Who are you comforting? Writes the Meiri in number 6, the last line, V'zo kvodo shel meis. Remember what we said from the beginning? What is the 2 elements of kindness you do with a Shiva call? Deference to the neshama, and deference to who? The people that are living. In this case, there are no relatives, but the neshama of the nifter's hovering where they lived, he or she, and therefore you give deference to the neshama, the holy soul of the deceased, by going to their home. So what did we just draw up? We drew up a scenario that you can have nichum avelim that is solely kavod, honor for who? For the nifter. But it is not chesed with the people that are alive because there's no relatives. I'll give you another example. There's a Mishnah in Brachas that Rabbi Gamliel, the great Tana, the Nasi, had an Eved Knaini. An Eved Knaini is a slave. A slave, al pi halacha, an Eved Knaini is bought off the slave market, was a non-Jewish man. He's given Mila, he's circumcised, goes to mikveh, and he's chayv in mitzvahs like a full-fledged Jewish woman. He's a half-Jew. Jewish woman is fully Jewish, of course, but an Eved Knaini is a half-Jew. If he would be freed and go to the mikveh second time, then he would become a full Jew. That's the Eraisa, according to the Rambam Filishni. The second time going to the mikveh, according to Yosef, was the Rabbana. But that's the definition of Eved Knaini. When Tevi, who was a great servant, died, the Mishnah writes, Rabbi Gamliel was Mekabel Tanchumin. He received comfort. People came and gave comfort to Rabbi Gamliel for the death of his Eved Knaini, Tevi Avdo. So the Rashba asks, but Tevi Avdo had no relatives. Why is Rabbi Gamliel? It wasn't his relative. So the Rashba quotes the Yerushalmi, he was Chavav Kibno. He did such a great job, he was so endeared to him like a son. Rav Zolti says you don't have to give that answer. Just say it's another example of what Kavod HaMeis, that they did Nichem Avelim. They did Nichem Avelim. They fulfilled comforting the mourner for deference to the deceased and not for Kavod HaChaim, because they weren't related. So we've just drawn up two examples where you can distill down Nichem Avelim solely being Kavod HaMeis and not being Kavod Chaim. So Hashta de Osis Lahachi. Now that we've arrived at this Nakuda, we can take it a step further. What happens when, God forbid, someone loses one of his 7 relatives, a person sits Shiva? Do we count Shabbos as a day of Shiva? Yes, we do. 2 reasons, writes the Ramban. Why? The Ramban was Nachmanides. The Rambam was Maimonides. When you pronounce Ramban, you stress the nun at the end, Ramban. The Ramban was 9 when the Rambam died. Amazing. I'm sure he longed to meet the Rambam. He never got an opportunity to meet the Rambam. He was 9 years old when the Rambam died. So the Ramban writes, I'll give you 2 reasons why Shabbos counts as a day of Shiva. Number 1, you can never have 7 days consecutive to have Shiva. Number 2, are there any elements of mourning on Shabbos? Yes, private mourning. What is private mourning? You know, intimacy is prohibited on Shabbos during Shiva. Bathing is prohibited. Studying regular Torah is prohibited. Private matters of mourning are observed on Shabbos. So that's another reason why we count Shabbos as a day of Shiva. I want to ask now, what happens in the following scenario? Rachmana litzlan, God forbid, someone loses a relative on Chol HaMoed. So what do? We do the Levaya. When does Shiva begin? Shiva begins the last day of Yontif in Chutz La'aretz. You count that as the first day of Shiva. You don't publicly sit, but it counts as day number 1, and then Isru Chag, the day afterwards, is day 2, and on and on. Now, on the last days of Yontif, what is the level of mourning? Is it like Shabbos, where there's private mourning, or is there no mourning at all? Everyone follow what we just presented? Is Yontif like Shabbos, that Shabbos has private mourning, and therefore it constitutes a day of Shiva Shabbos? That everyone agrees to. So is Yontif like that? Even though you won't start Shiva, the count doesn't start till the last day. But the 7th day of Yontif, what do? Do we say it's like Shabbos, that there is private mourning? Or do we say it's Yontif is different than Shabbos and there is no mourning at all, both publicly and even privately? This question is a dispute between the Rambam against the Rosh and the Tur. This is a dispute between the Rambam against the Rosh and the Tur. The Kesef Mishnah writes explicitly, if you go to page 3, it's number 12. If you look in Mara Mokom 12, the Rambam writes, he says an amazing thing. He says, Rambam says that there is no Avelis at all. Number 12, a Regalim, Chen Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim, Ein Dover Medibra Avelis Noig Behen. And the Kesef Mishnah, the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber interprets the Rambam in the following vein. On Yontif, there is nothing. The Rambam writes there is no level of mourning at all. It is not like Shabbos. It is completely void of mourning. there is simcha on Yom Tov. And that simcha does not allow any mourning to surface, both privately and publicly. Nothing. So the Rambam says Yom Tov is different than Shabbos. And the Rosh and the Tur say no. It is like Shabbos, just like Shabbos is private mourning, on the Yom Tov there also be private mourning. So based on this, the Mishnah writes, if you go to number now 14, turn the page. The Mishnah writes, Shulchan Aruch says we hold like the Rosh and Tur. There is mourning, but the Rambam says not. And in number 15, it says Menachem im Avelim b'moed. The Mishnah writes in Moed Katan. There is a notion of Nichem Avelim that you were bothered by in the beginning. How can you pay a Shiva call on Yom Tov? How could that be? Thought there's no mourning on Yom Tov. So I want to plug this in accordingly. According to the Rambam, who says there's no level of mourning at all, what is the purpose of paying the Shiva call on Yom Tov? What are you doing? You're paying deference only to who? The person that passed away. The person that's nifter. So now we have 3 examples of Nichem Avelim that is no kavod to the Chaim. Number 1 was what? Someone who had no relatives. Number 2, Tevi the Eved. Right? The Eved Knaini. And number 3, according to the Rambam, on Yom Tov. According to the Rosh and the Tur, though, according to the Rosh and the Tur, what is the purpose of Nichem Avelim on Moed? Not only kavod hameis, but also what? The person is observing mourning on what? A private level. So you also are comforting the Chaim too, not just the mace. Does everyone follow what we just said? We have a Mishnah. The Mishnah says Menachem Avelim b'moed. So how do you interpret that and plug in your opinion to read the Mishnah accordingly? According to the Rambam, Menachem Avelim b'moed just shows deference to the nifter, the deceased. Because according to the Rambam, the person that's living has no avelus at all, both publicly and privately. But according to the Rosh and Tur, there is a private mourning. So when you pay the Shiva call, it's a double what? Chesed. You're paying deference to the mace, to the deceased, and also the people that are what? Now, granted, they're not started Shiva yet, but they are mourning on a private level. Everyone with me? See, if we go slow, everyone can understand the Torah. The beauty of the Torah. This is called Lumdus. This is Rav Soloveitchik devoted most of his life to. Saying shiurim, kashas, answers. He writes a beautiful, beautiful piece when he was like 4 or 5. He was a little boy, and his father was at the table with Talmidim around, and his father would ask a kasha, a question on the Rambam, and he would run into the kitchen as a little boy and ask his mom, "What's going to happen? I'm scared. How are we going to save the Rambam?" And she would say, "Calm down. Your father will solve the question." It's the way the Rav writes it is so beautiful. As a little boy, this is what he was trained in. So it comes out, if we think now, we can plug it in beautifully. What was the original question we asked? What was the Rambam's opinion? The Rambam said that paying the Shiva call beat out visiting the sick because it's a double chesed as opposed to a single chesed, correct? But we said the Rambam's against the Gemara. That Tzadikim Yishalayim on Sukkot did what? They first visited the sick, then they paid the Shiva call. So let's think. The Rambam would say the Kash is not a good question. Why? Because on Sukkot, which is a Yontif, right? What is the purpose of paying the Shiva call? The people you're going to visit are not availing at all, publicly and privately. So why are you going? It's only kavod hameis. And what is visiting the sick?
What is visiting the sick? Kavod Chaim. In halacha, in Judaism, do we look at Kavod Chaim or Kavod Meis being greater? Kavod Chaim. Always alive. Of course we care about the dead. We have deference and we bury the dead. But if push comes to shove, a live person, the halacha gives more honor to than a person that's passed away. There's no doubt about that. And therefore I have a triage choice, says the Tzaddik in Yerushalayim. Should I visit the sick first? Should I pay the Shiva call? Well, on Yontif, you visit the sick, says the Rambam. Whereas the Rambam we start off is talking about every other day of the year, not on Yontif. So therefore, if it's not on Yontif, it's a double chesed, paying the Shiva call. Then that beats out visiting the sick. Everyone got the answer? Very sharp answer, no? That's what Rav Schulte writes, the great chief rabbi in Yerushalayim. However, now, let's plug it in according to the Rosh, the other opinion. Do you remember we said the Rosh flipped the Girsa? He had a different text of what the Tzaddikim in Yerushalayim did. What was his Girsa? That they first paid the Shiva call, then they did visiting the sick. Why is that? Why is that consistent with his opinion? Because what do we say the Rosh's opinion of what happens when you have a situation of burying a mace on Chol HaMoed? What is the level of a mourning on Yontif? What do we say that was? It's like Shabbos, excellent, it's private mourning. So now let's plug it in according to the Rosh. You have the Tzaddikim Yerushalayim, they have to make a decision. Should we visit the sick first, or should we do Nicham Avelim? What's the answer? Nicham Avelim. Because when you pay the Shiva call, it's Chesed to the mace, deference to the Neshama, and it's also deference to who? The people that are alive. Why? Because they, even though they haven't started Shiva, but they're privately mourning. If they're privately mourning, it's Chesed with the people that are alive too. And therefore, if that's the case, according to the Rosh, the Nicham Avelim beats out the Bikur Cholim. It's solely Chesed with the person that's alive. Hopefully the person gets better. So the Rosh is consistent too. And the Rosh argues with the Rambam because of his own opinion. So what he says in Hilchos Avelis is consistent with what he says about the Tzaddikim Yerushalayim. So now we've solved the question. We answered the question, says Rav Schulte, that this dispute between the Rambam and the Rosh is in accordance with their opinion. And it goes l'shitaso. Now, we can even take this a step further. How do we take this a step further? There is a notion that the Mishnah says in Moed Katan, at the Levaya, in the cemetery, we say, Potrin Sarabi Midei Chavasa. So the parish on the side says, we tell them everyone they can go home after the Levaya. But the Nemuk Yosef says, B'Shem the Ravid. You know what it means? It means that you don't have to pay a Shiva call again. See, according to the Rambam, all you did on Yontif was do Kavod HaMeis. I would have thought you have to go again after Yontif to fulfill the mitzvah Kavod Chaim. The answer is no. Chiddush the Mishnah is Am Yotzei. As long as I fulfilled one element, it's fine. I don't have to go again. Might not have been ideal, but I don't have to go again. So, if that's the case, says Rav Schulte, what happens in the following? We know that when the Beis Din existed, there was death penalty. There was a death penalty. If a person was a murderer and there were witnesses and warning, then they would be executed. By Beis Din. He accepted the warning and he still did the murder, we execute him. Does the family sit Shiva for a person who's executed by Beis Din? So the Gemara says, no, they don't. Why not? Because we only sit Shiva for a person that as soon as they're interred into the ground, they receive an atonement in Shamayim by Hashem. This person, this wicked person that's executed, was a murderer. He will only receive atonement from his execution later on. So since he's not given kapara immediately, when the Gemara writes the principle kevid at nidche. Once it's pushed off, it's always pushed off. And you never sit Shiva. So Rashi asks, what about Akover Beis Beregel? Our case. Someone dies Chol Hamoed. Do we sit Shiva right away? No, we push it off till after what? The last day of Yontif. Why do we say, oh, you couldn't sit Shiva right away? Push it off for good and there's no Shiva. What's the difference? You know what the difference Rashi says? Because it was started a little bit. Because people started paying Shiva calls, even though Shiva hadn't begun. And Rashi is postulating, Poshuv Shad, that there's private mourning, like the Rush and the Tour. If there's private mourning, then it started. Even though the formal Shiva didn't start, but it started. So don't tell me since it didn't start, push it off forever. It started a little bit. But according to the Rambam, that there's no level of mourning at all, both publicly and privately, why don't we say Kevin and Nidche? Once it was pushed off, should never do it. Why do you have Shiva afterwards? So says the Yad Ramah that a time impediment is a technicality. A time impediment is only technical. And we don't say Kevin and Nidche. You only say Kevin and Nidche once it's pushed off, if there's an inherent integral problem. If the man is a wicked man who's a murderer, then we say since he doesn't receive atonement immediately after the interment, we push it off for good. But here, a time impediment is technical. So something like that, we don't say Kevin and Nidche. That's how the Rama would answer that Gemara. So you see that the halacha has a statement. What should we do when we want to engage in doing a kindness? Should you pay the Shiva call or should you visit the sick? And we have a whole theory behind it. So what I want to get to now is, and the Rav discussed this at great length, why is it when we engage in Mitzvos Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, why is there no bracha? When you visit the sick, why is there no bracha? You ever thought about that? When you pay a Shiva call, there is no bracha. When you have a guest over, hospitality, there's no bracha. Any mitzvah between man and man, there is no bracha. Bracha is only recited on Mitzvos Bein Adam L'Makom, like lulav, like shofar, like matzah. A mitzvah between God and man, you say a bracha. You don't say a bracha on mitzvah of kindness. Why not? Rambam says there is a rule that you don't, and he doesn't say why. So Rav Soloveitchik suggested, and Rav Fran Shlita also has quoted the Rav saying this. What is the purpose of a bracha? Why do we say brachas? There are four categories of brachas in halacha. What are the four categories of brachas, says Avidrom? One is birkas nenin, bracha on food. Number two is birkas on mitzvah, a bracha on a mitzvah. A lulav, a shofar, matzah. What's number three? Bracha on shavach vodah, praise and thanks to Hashem. You say a bracha on hearing thunder and seeing lightning. Right? You do that after you hear it. The bracha on eating, you say before you eat. The bracha on a mitzvah, you do it before you do the mitzvah. The bracha on praising and thanking Hashem, you do after you hear the thunder, you say the bracha. After you see the lightning, you say the bracha. And what's number four? Brachas that pertain to davening. There are four categories of brachas. So the Rambam compares, in Perek Aleph Halacha Beis those brachas on food to brachas on mitzvahs. Why must I say a bracha before I eat? The Gemara says it's stealing from Hashem. It's trespassing. Hashem's glory fills up the whole world. By me eating this orange without saying a brei ha'etz, I'm stealing from Hashem. It's trespassing. The bracha is a matir, gives me license and permissibility to eat this orange. It releases the isser. So the Rambam says that's the same thing of Birkas HaMitzvah. What do you mean Birkas HaMitzvah? It's a chutzpah for me to take a lulav and shake it without saying a bracha. Philosophically, it's a chutzpah. Why is it a chutzpah? It looks like batting practice. How do I focus and sanctify that act? I say a bracha beforehand. The bracha also, in a sense, permits me to engage in a mitzvah. It also allows me to focus and sanctify this act. Many Hasidim have a beautiful minhag where they say, Hini muchen mezumah. Here I am ready to do the following mitzvah. The Dovid Hirsch and the Rabbi Zatzal said, what? There's no need to do that. It's a nice minhag. But the bracha itself should ready you. That's what the Litvak said. The Litvaks say. What do you have to say Hini muchen mezumah for? The bracha itself readies you, prepares you, focuses you. And that's why the Rambam compares Birkas HaMitzvah to Birkas Nenen. Just like Birkas Nenen allows you to eat, the bracha on the mitzvah allows you to engage in a mitzvah. So listen to this. The Rav said, you go visit someone in the hospital. Someone, God forbid, ill. You go pay a shiva call. Someone, God forbid, sitting shiva. You're going to recite a bracha? What, the person in the hospital is like an esrog? The person that's sitting shiva is like an esrog that you say a bracha? The mitzvah of Ben Adam L'Chaver should come naturally from your heart. You should not need a bracha to ready you, to focus you. It's antithetical to say a bracha on a mitzvah Ben Adam L'Chaver. It defeats the whole purpose of the nature of the mitzvah. Oy vavoy, they say in Hebrew, to someone that needs a bracha to ready yourself to do the chesed. It should come naturally. That's why the Rambam postulates his rule. There is no bracha on a mitzvah bein adam l'chavero. There cannot be a bracha. It's inappropriate to have such a bracha. And therefore, the Rambam says, the only time we have brachas are on mitzvahs bein adam l'makom. And the Rambam writes that the whole point of doing these mitzvahs of chesed is to emulate Hashem, is to have a feeling of goodness, of good wishes to your friend, that anything you want good to happen to you, you want to happen to them. And this is just a vehicle to get to that feeling. To the degree of the Anshe L'Shlomo, the great Gaon, the Anshe L'Shlomo, the great Gaon, of Shmukel Berman, Rosh Yeshiva in Ponovich, that's how. He once suggested that if you went to the hospital to visit someone and they were discharged already, but you had such a good feeling in your heart that you want to make this person feel good and encourage them to get better, then maybe you would have fulfilled the mitzvah. Because you didn't do the act, the person was discharged already, but you had that feeling. One of the mitzvahs that are rabbinic, which fulfills a kiyum d'oraisa after rechamo, is kfuras hametz. So a friend asks him to sefer, but he's not reachah b'mitzvahs. The person already passed away. So how is that a kiyum? All these rabbinic mitzvahs of bikkur chol nichaverim are kiyumim, kfuras hametz, are kiyum after rechamo, but they have to be reachah b'mitzvah. They have to be alive. The person's nifter. No, as long as you have the feeling. The feeling is the ikr. Is the most important nekuda. The principle is the feeling, the natural feeling you're supposed to have. And therefore it's antithetical to have a bracha. Happens to be once in a while, there might be a mitzvah bein adam l'makom too. For example, you remember Hallel during the Seder on Pesach night? During the Seder, do we say a bracha before we start Hallel? In the shul we always say a bracha. Today we did this morning. But do we say a bracha before we start Hallel in the Seder? No, why not? Because Rav Hai Gaon writes, says the Ran, that it's a spontaneous outcry of praise to Hashem. We relive the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus of Egypt. When you relive something, it should be a spontaneous outcry. Oh, I need a bracha to ready myself? That's not spontaneous. Now that, what'd you say? Okay, so if you're Chassidish, Lomais. But even if not, but there's no bracha, because it has to be spontaneous, and that's a mitzvah bein adam l'makom. That's bein adam l'makom. Staka is bein adam l'chavero. There's no bracha on staka. There's no bracha. Exactly. Some say because why you might not accept it, the yoni. So it might be a bracha levatala. But according to the Rambam, because you have to be natural feeling, has to be a natural feeling. A bracha is antithetical to that.
Kibbut Avim.
Kibbut Avim also no bracha. Now is that ben adam l'makom ben l'chavera? And Minchas Chinuch says I'm not sure. Pashup Pshat it's ben adam l'chavera, because the parents can say you don't have to stand up for me. That's what the Minchas Chinuch wants to claim. It's a mitzvah ben adam l'chavera. So I want to just close with the following, and that is that, you know, the halacha mandates everything we do in life, as the Rav Zatzal developed what we call ish halacha, a man of the halacha, a woman of the halacha. And we cannot just have the attitude that I'm going to engage in chesed. We must engage in chesed, no doubt, and it should come naturally. But there are times we have to make priority decisions. Which comes first, which comes second, which comes third. And the Rambam gives us the guidelines based on the Gemara of what we're supposed to do. And we have to think about that and encourage our children to think about how we can do mitzvahs of chesed. Because we as Jews are recognized as being Jewish people because we are kind. We are gomei chasadim. We work in the office. We work with non-Jews. And you're the only Yid in the group. You should be the kindest person. Because number one, that's innately what a Yid is. But number two is we have a general obligation that anything we do in life, any decision, any activity, any behavior, Shem Shamayim Misahev Al Yadecha. Let God's name become more beloved because of my action and my activity and my decision. If we do that, Hashem will look down, God willing, in Shamayim, and say, my nation, my chosen people, are fulfilling their mandate of being gomlei chasadim, and they're doing it not just in a general way, they're doing it in a specific way, following the halacha in a triage case, what comes first, what comes second, and what comes third. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu bless us and give us divine assistance that we always engage in chesed throughout our lives. Thank you for listening, everyone. Have a good evening.
We'll daven Mariv. Oh, unless there are questions, then we'll daven Mariv afterwards. After questions.
One of the two Rambams where it appeared that he was contradicting himself.